Not everything we find along the way should be taken home. I thought it was just an injured cat, lost on that deserted road on an ordinary night. But something in its eyes held me, something I couldn't explain. Since then, my life has never been the same. There are certain presences you feel, even when they're not there. Presences you try to forget, but somehow they keep watching, waiting. I thought I could ignore the signs, but now I know that some things you should never get close to. The night was cold and silent. Only the sound of the wind cutting through the trees and the creaking of my pedaling broke the emptiness around me. The road was long, lonely, surrounded by open fields and a few spaced-out houses, almost all dark at that hour. It was always like this after an exhausting shift at the factory. The weight of fatigue made my mind wander, focused only on getting home, taking a shower, and collapsing into bed. But that night, something was different. At first, I thought I saw a shadow moving on the road ahead. I squinted, trying to see better. There were no streetlights, only the weak lights from my bike illuminating part of the way. The black thing on the ground seemed small, motionless. I slowed down, and my heart started beating faster. As I got closer, the shape began to take form. It was a cat, a small black cat, lying in the middle of the road. I stopped the bike, and absolute silence took over the moment. There was something strange about it. The cat didn't run away when I got close, as most would. It was still, and as I crouched, I could see that it was gravely injured. Its fur, as black as the night, was stained with blood. It was breathing heavily and slowly. I looked around, expecting to see a car or a nearby house, as if I wanted to find an explanation for what was happening. Nothing, just the empty road and the moonless sky. The cat stared at me, its blue eyes glowing in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if something was warning me not to get involved. Maybe it was the fatigue, but I heard a small voice in my head, almost inaudible, begging me to keep riding and leave it behind. However, the animal's gaze seemed to plead for help. It was helpless, and I couldn't just ignore it. I crouched closer and, hesitantly, touched its cold fur. The cat didn't resist. It just kept staring at me, its chest moving slowly, as if it was on the brink of death. "Hang in there, I'm going to help you," I muttered, still with an odd feeling clinging to me. Carefully, I lifted the small body and placed it in the basket of my bike, being cautious not to worsen its injuries. I pedaled the rest of the way home with a heavy heart, wondering what I would do once I got there. The whole time, I could feel the cat's gaze on me, as if it hadn't taken its eyes off my back, even while wounded. When I finally saw my house, a small, worn-out place, I sighed in relief. I got off the bike, still unable to shake the strange sense of unease hanging in the air. I entered the house with the cat carefully cradled in my arms. The place was quiet. Only the light sound of my footsteps echoed through the small, cramped corridors. I went straight to the bathroom, where I improvised a little bed with some old towels and a blanket. The cat didn't move much, just blinked slowly, still watching me with those large, penetrating eyes. "I'll find something for you to eat," I said, more to myself than to him, trying to break the growing discomfort that was building up. I went to the kitchen and found a bag of cat food I usually kept for when the neighborhood cats showed up. I put a handful in a small bowl and brought it to the cat, hoping it would start eating, but to my surprise, it only sniffed the food and turned its head. "Don't like it, huh?" I murmured, puzzled. I brought over some leftover chicken from my own meal, not really expecting it to be interested. To my surprise, as soon as I put the piece near him, the cat devoured the food with an impressive speed. Its eyes shone intensely for a moment as it chewed, almost as if it had been starving for days. I thought maybe it was the shock or weakness that made it avoid the cat food. I gave it another piece of chicken, and it devoured it with the same voracity. After eating, the cat seemed a little more alert, but its appearance didn't change. It remained small, fragile, with its body still covered in bloodstains. I gently ran my hand over its head. "I think I'll call you Lucius," I said aloud, laughing at myself. It looked at me as if it understood. And at that moment, I had the strange feeling that the name fit perfectly. But something was wrong. The cat, despite eating so much, didn't seem to gain strength. It remained small, almost skinny, and its breathing was still slightly irregular. I stood up and went to prepare some water to clean its wounds, trying not to think too much about the oddities of the encounter. But as the night went on, a creeping sense of discomfort began to grow within me. During the night, while I tried to sleep, the feeling that something wasn't right wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cat's gaze on me, and it wasn't just my imagination. I could swear I heard its soft footsteps around the house, even when it should have been resting. I opened my eyes in the dark, and for a moment, I almost saw Lucius' shadow standing in the corner of the room, watching me in silence. I blinked quickly, and the figure vanished as if it had never been there. But the chill on my skin remained. Something was off. Something was wrong with that cat. And that first night, the last thing I saw before falling asleep was the intense glow of two blue eyes in the depths of the darkness. Time passed quickly, almost without me realizing it. Cold nights turned into humid mornings, and the work routine absorbed me so much that the days blended together in a sequence of exhaustion and silence. But what bothered me most, what most disturbed my thoughts, was Lucius. Since that first night, the cat had become a constant presence in my home. More than constant, it became obsessive. Wherever I went, it was there, watching me with those intense blue eyes. If I went to the kitchen, it would sit in a corner, silent, just staring at me. If I tried to take a shower, it would sit outside the door, meowing softly, as if it hated being apart. Even when I slept, I felt the weight of its fixed gaze on me, as if it didn't take its eyes off me for even a second. At first, I tried to rationalize it. "It's just a needy cat," I told myself. "Maybe it went through some trauma before it found you. It just needs time to adjust." But as the months passed, Lucius' behavior didn't change. If anything, it became even more intense. It seemed to hate any moment I left it alone. If I stayed late at work, when I came home, I would find scratched furniture and overturned objects, as if it had gone wild in my absence. The silence that once ruled my house was now always filled with those persistent meows and Lucius' constant presence. No matter where I was, it was always there. Always. The strangest thing, however, was that despite eating an absurd amount of food, Lucius didn't grow. It remained small, fragile, as if time simply didn't affect its body. Every time I offered it cat food, it completely ignored it but devoured anything from my own meals. And always with the same voracity as when I first found it. I started making jokes to myself about how it must be a gourmet cat, but something inside me knew there was more to it. Once, I decided to do some research online. I looked up cats with unusual eating habits, obsessive behaviors, even rare diseases that could explain why Lucius wasn't growing, but nothing seemed to fit. Each page left me more frustrated, and the explanations I found only heightened my suspicion. At night, in bed, I would toss and turn, unable to escape the growing feeling that something was off. It was as if it were lurking, waiting for the exact moment to do something I didn't know what. And I was beginning to feel a deep discomfort with its presence. That sense of alertness I had felt on the road when I first saw it never completely went away. It was always there, an itch in the back of my mind that I tried to ignore but that kept nagging at me. One day, tired and mentally exhausted, I spoke out loud, as if trying to convince myself, "It's just a cat. Stop it." Lucius, of course, was there, lying on the armchair on the other side of the room, staring at me intently with unblinking eyes. The routine, however, began to wear me down. The work was the same, but now I felt exhausted before the day even began. There was a strange sense of oppression in my house, as if the air was heavier and everything seemed darker than usual. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched all the time, but I couldn't. One morning, after a restless night, I woke up with Lucius lying on my chest, staring at me with its fixed eyes. It didn't meow, didn't move. It just looked at me. My heart raced, and its weight felt heavier than its small, fragile body should. I need to do something, I thought. In the following days, I tried to keep him away from me for longer. When I left for work, I made sure to lock the door tightly, hoping he would get used to being alone for more hours. But every time I came back, I found the house in chaos. He would meow desperately as soon as he saw me, and I couldn't ignore the growing anxiety in my chest. Until one night, something happened that made me realize I was no longer dealing with just a simple animal. I was in the kitchen, making a snack, while Lucius sat a few feet away, watching my every move. The silence was oppressive. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine. I turned slowly, and there he was, still sitting, but there was something different in his gaze. It was as if, at that moment, he was evaluating more than my movements. Evaluating me. Something in that exchange of looks gave me the feeling that the cat wasn't just present. He was aware, conscious in a way that wasn't natural. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the irrational fear growing inside me. "It's just a cat," I repeated to myself for the 100th time. But Lucius kept watching me, and for the first time, I wondered if he was waiting for me to do something, or if he was waiting for the right moment to act. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was deeply wrong with that cat. And now, all that silence seemed to foreshadow something I couldn't yet understand. But that was approaching quickly. The night was clear, the sky speckled with stars. I needed some time to think, to breathe away from the suffocating feeling that had taken over the house. I could no longer ignore the growing discomfort, so I decided to take my bike for a ride around town, something that always helped me clear my head. It was as if pedaling through the empty streets, feeling the cold night air, helped me organize my thoughts. As usual, Lucius insisted on coming with me. He always hated being left alone, and lately, he seemed more desperate than ever to stay by my side. I hesitated to bring him along, considering leaving him locked inside the house, but that constant, insistent meowing wore me down. I grabbed an improvised box and tied it to the bike with ropes, placing the small cat inside. He settled down strangely calmly, his blue eyes watching me in silence. I pedaled through the empty streets, trying not to think too much about Lucius, but I couldn't. Not after all these months of strange behavior, the way he seemed to grow and feed in a manner I couldn't understand. But there, in the silence of the night, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe it was just the fatigue, or the loneliness slowly messing with my nerves. As I pedaled, the wind against my face, the familiar sound of the bike chain comforted me. The weight of the day started to fade, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The empty road ahead was a safe space, free from the oppressive presence of Lucius' eyes always watching me. Then suddenly, something crossed my path. It was too fast to understand what it was at first, but soon I realized it was a rat. It darted in front of us, and the sudden movement made my heart race. Before I could react, Lucius jumped out of the box. With an agility I had never seen before, he leapt from the bike as if he had launched himself into the air. I slammed on the brakes, and the sharp screech of the tires echoed down the deserted road. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying to understand what had just happened. Lucius had landed on the ground with frightening precision. His black silhouette against the dark pavement looked more like a living shadow than an ordinary animal. My eyes followed his movements as he slowly approached the rat, which was desperately trying to flee. Before the rodent could escape, Lucius pounced on it with a ferocity that made my blood run cold. The cat grabbed the rat between its teeth effortlessly, but what happened next was what truly disturbed me. I was expecting the typical behavior of a common cat, maybe some cruel play or a quick bite to finish the prey. But that's not what happened. No, what I saw was far, far worse. Lucius devoured the entire rat. He bit into the small animal's body with force and speed, crushing the flesh and bones with a voracity I had never seen in any living creature. The sound of bones snapping between his teeth was horrible, like the dry crack of twigs being broken. In a matter of seconds, the rat was no more than a bloody mess that Lucius swallowed without hesitation. My stomach churned as I watched, helpless, at that grotesque scene. But the worst was yet to come. As Lucius devoured the rat, his body changed. He seemed to grow, not much, but enough for me to notice. His form distorted for a brief moment, as if he were expanding. His paws widened, his back stretched, and for a moment, he looked much bigger, more menacing than the small, harmless cat I had brought home. My eyes widened, and for a second, I nearly lost my balance on the bike. I blinked several times, trying to process what I was seeing. The cat was growing in front of me, absorbing something from the rat that wasn't just flesh. There was an aura, something I couldn't explain, but it made a wave of icy fear rush down my spine. Then, suddenly, as if nothing had happened, Lucius returned to his normal size. He calmly licked his paws, his blue eyes fixed on me, shining under the dim light of the distant street lamps. It was as if what I had just witnessed was nothing but an illusion, but I knew it wasn't. It had happened. The way he devoured the rat, the sudden growth, and then the return to normalcy. I was frozen. The bike was tilted to the side, my hands trembling slightly on the handlebars. Lucius took a few steps toward me, his eyes still watching me closely. There was no longer the usual lightness of a cat in his movements. No, he moved with a strange precision, as if evaluating every step, every decision. I felt my heart racing, my breathing heavy in my chest. That was the moment when any sensible person would leave the cat behind and run. But I couldn't move. Something held me there, kept me staring at that animal that, for months, had been in my house, living under the same roof. But now I knew, without a doubt, it was not normal. What the hell are you? I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I wanted. Lucius just looked at me, his blue eyes glowing intensely in the night, and I knew, in that instant, that what I had brought into my home was no ordinary cat. There was something inside him, something I didn't understand. Suddenly, he turned and walked back to the bike, jumping back into the improvised box with the same calm as always, as if nothing had happened, as if he were just the same small, fragile, and defenseless cat I had found on that lonely road. I got on the bike, but my legs were trembling. The pedal felt heavy, as if an invisible force was holding me back. I forced myself to continue to pedal to take that thing back home. But that night, one thing was certain. Lucius was not just any animal. The days that followed the rat incident were a blur of unease. The image of Lucius devouring that animal so brutally and momentarily growing continued to hammer in my mind. A disturbing memory I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. There was something deeply wrong with that cat, but admitting it out loud seemed insane. Who would believe me? A cat that grows and shrinks when it eats its prey? I could already hear the laughter of anyone I tried to tell. So I tried to go on with my life. I kept going to work, trying to focus on the routine, and ignore the growing feeling that something dark was happening around me. But Lucius wouldn't let me forget. He never let me forget. It was as if, from that moment on the road, he had become a constant, suffocating presence. Wherever I went in the house, Lucius' eyes were always on me, watching in silence. Before, he used to follow me around the rooms, but now, even when I didn't see him, I felt him there. If I was in the kitchen, preparing something to eat, I could feel his eyes fixed on my back. When I sat on the couch to try to relax, the weight of his gaze pressed on me, even if he wasn't in sight. In the dead of night, I could feel his light body moving around the room, his blue eyes glowing in the dark like two sinister lanterns. I started avoiding eye contact with him. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt as if he were trying to tell me something. Not with words, but with that cold intensity that emanated from his gaze. There was something in that deep blue that felt more than animal. It was as if those eyes hid an ancient secret, something malevolent and much, much older than I could imagine. I tried to ignore it. I tried to live my life normally. But Lucius' presence was like a constant shadow, surrounding me, watching me, even in the moments I thought I was alone. Some nights, I woke up with my heart racing, certain that something was watching me. Something bigger than the simple cat that should have been sleeping in some corner of the house. And always, I would find his blue eyes fixed on me in the dim light, as if he never really slept. The situation began to weigh even more when my neighbors started complaining about strange things happening around us. I was sitting on the porch one afternoon, trying to relax after work, when I overheard two of them talking. "Did you see? Mrs. Miller's cat has been missing for 3 days. She said she went out to get some milk, and when she came back, nothing. The cat vanished like it never existed." One of them commented, while the other nodded, concerned. "Yeah, and the Petersons' dog disappeared last week too. A huge golden retriever, and they didn't even hear him bark. Just disappeared." My body froze when I heard that. The disappearances started increasing in the neighborhood, and soon the news spread. Dogs and cats from nearby houses began disappearing without a trace. And every time I heard about a new disappearance, I couldn't help but feel that Lucius was somehow involved. It was impossible not to make the connection, even if it didn't make sense. I had no proof, just a growing suspicion that consumed me. I started noticing that on the days when a new animal went missing, Lucius seemed even more content. There was a different aura about him, as if he were reveling in something only he understood. I would catch him looking at me with an even more intense gaze, his blue eyes carrying that menacing gleam that made my stomach churn. Sometimes, when he looked at me, I could swear he was smiling. Not with his mouth, but with his eyes. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something terrible. One night, after yet another conversation at work about the disappearances, I came home already on edge. I slammed the door shut harder than necessary and leaned against the wood, feeling the weight of the oppressive silence inside the house. Lucius was there as always, sitting in the hallway, watching me, his eyes fixed on mine with a disturbing calm. "You know something, don't you?" I asked, more to myself than to him. But hearing my own voice in the silence of the house, something inside me shuddered. Lucius didn't move, didn't meow. He just stared at me. The nights became harder. My mind was always occupied with questions, with doubts. I couldn't sleep properly. When I finally managed to close my eyes, nightmares haunted me. I dreamed I was being followed by those blue eyes, that Lucius moved through the shadows, growing larger, more monstrous, chasing me through the deserted streets of the city. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and there he was, sitting in the corner of the room, watching me. The impression that he knew what I was dreaming, what I was feeling, became stronger each day. But I couldn't just get rid of him. Something stopped me from doing that. It was as if, despite the fear, something bound me to Lucius. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the fact that somehow I felt responsible for bringing him into my life. No matter what I did, he was with me now, and it seemed like nothing could change that. The disappearances continued, and the murmurs among the neighbors only grew. They talked about wild predators, even animal thieves, but deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. And I knew that somehow Lucius was involved. Every time a dog or cat disappeared, he seemed more satisfied, calmer, and yet his eyes kept watching me, always, without rest. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly under surveillance. The psychological pressure grew with each passing day. Those bright, deep blue eyes, hiding secrets I would never be able to unravel. Something was about to happen. I could feel it. But whatever it was, I knew it had to do with Lucius. And I knew that when it happened, there would be no turning back. I needed something to distance me from Lucius. Something to bring me back to normalcy. That's why I decided to invite Elizabeth over for dinner. She had been working with me at the factory for a few months, and we had started getting closer. It was casual until then, but I knew there was some chemistry between us. Part of me believed that if I could focus on something other than the suffocating presence of the cat, maybe in some way I could return to who I was before. I spent the day planning the dinner. A simple meal, but one that would show some effort. Roasted chicken with vegetables and a good wine. It wasn't much, but for me it was important. Maybe this dinner would be the first step in lifting the weight of Lucius and everything he had brought into my life. Elizabeth accepted the invitation with a warm smile, and that gave me brief relief. For a few hours, the anticipation of the dinner made me forget about Lucius' ever-watchful eyes, which observed me with more intensity each day. Deep down, I knew he would sense that something was happening, but I forced myself to ignore that possibility. When Elizabeth arrived, the sound of her laughter lit up the house in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. She looked beautiful, wearing a simple but elegant dress, bringing with her a light and contagious energy. We sat in the living room, drank some wine, and for a few moments, I really managed to relax. Lucius, however, was always nearby, reminding me of his constant presence. He moved from side to side, his paws softly tapping the floor, as if he were restless. We went to the kitchen where the chicken was roasting in the oven. As I set the table, I felt the air change, becoming heavier. Lucius had jumped onto the kitchen counter, and for the first time, he wasn't just watching me. He was acting. His posture was tense, his eyes fixed on the chicken roasting in the oven. I had seen him obsessed with food before, but never like this. His blue eyes were focused on the dish as if it were a living prey. "Hey, get down," I said firmly, but he didn't move. With a quick motion, he tried to grab one of the prepared dishes, knocking over some silverware in the process. I turned quickly and pushed him back. "Get out of here, Lucius." My voice came out louder than I intended. The sound echoed through the small kitchen, and Elizabeth, who was opening the wine in the living room, appeared at the door with a curious smile on her face. "The cat doesn't give you a break, does he?" she said, laughing lightly, but her expression changed when she saw the tension in my eyes. Lucius growled at me, something he had never done before. It was a low, deep sound that seemed to vibrate through the kitchen. I stared at him, my heart racing. He no longer looked like the small, fragile cat I had found on the road. There was something in his posture, something threatening, as if he were on edge. I felt a wave of anger wash over me. "That's enough," I shouted, grabbing Lucius by the scruff of his neck and tossing him out of the kitchen, almost with brutality. He let out a sharp meow, and I heard his paws scratch the floor as he landed in the hallway. For a moment, I thought he would come after me, but instead Lucius ran to the back of the house, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. I stood there, my chest rising and falling rapidly as I tried to steady my breathing. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked, her soft voice bringing me back to reality. I turned to her, trying to smile. "Yes, it's just, he's been complicated lately," I said, feeling sweat accumulate on my forehead. "Let's have dinner." We tried to go on with the dinner. Elizabeth did her best to keep the conversation light and casual, and I forced myself to participate, but my mind was elsewhere, still trapped in that moment of confrontation with Lucius. I had never felt that aggression in him before. Something inside me knew that I had crossed a line. After dinner, the evening seemed to be returning to normal. We talked, laughed, and for a brief moment, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was fine. Elizabeth stood up and excused herself to use the bathroom. I smiled and pointed to the hallway, explaining where it was. She gave me a light touch on the shoulder and walked down, her footsteps lightly echoing through the quiet house. I stayed seated at the table, trying to enjoy the moment of peace. Minutes passed, and the house grew strangely quiet. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Elizabeth," I called out, expecting to hear her answer from the bathroom. But nothing. No sound, no door opening, just silence. I got up from the chair, a feeling of unease growing in my chest. I walked to the hallway. "Elizabeth." The concern in my voice was clear now, but still, there was no response. My heart started to beat faster, and a terrible cold settled in my stomach. I walked slowly down the dark hallway, feeling the floor creak under my feet. As I approached the bathroom, a growing sense of dread took over me, as if something horrible was about to happen. When I reached the bathroom door, it was slightly ajar. My stomach churned as I pushed the door open slowly and saw the scene inside. At first, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. It seemed unreal, a nightmare that my mind refused to accept. But reality hit me hard. Elizabeth was lying on the floor, her body limp, and what remained of her head. Lucius was there on top of her. But he was no longer the small, fragile cat I knew. He had transformed into something monstrous. His body had grown grotesquely, a mass of muscles and distorted bones, his elongated paws and claws sharp as blades. His eyes, still blue, shone intensely, and his mouth was stained with blood. He was devouring Elizabeth's head, biting and crushing bones and flesh with an indescribable ferocity. I couldn't move. The shock completely paralyzed me. The smell of blood, the sound of bones breaking between Lucius' teeth, it all hit me at once. My eyes widened, and a wave of pure terror washed over me. He lifted his eyes to me, his blue eyes glowing with a cruel intelligence, and for a moment, I felt like he was smiling. My breath caught in my throat. The world around me started spinning, the horror of the scene crushing any attempt at rationality. Lucius was no ordinary cat. He never was. And now, facing what he had become, I knew I was dealing with something much, much worse than any nightmare I could imagine. My legs nearly gave out as I stumbled backward, pulling away from that impossible and horrible scene. Blood dripped from Lucius' mouth as he chewed on Elizabeth's remains, his blue eyes still fixed on me, full of malice and intelligence that didn't belong to an animal. This was no longer a cat. It never had been. It was a monster far more dangerous, and I knew I was next. With a scream that came out more like a muffled sob, I turned in the hallway and ran toward the kitchen. My sweaty hands slid against the walls as I struggled to keep my balance. I could hear the sound of claws scraping against the floor behind me, a low, menacing noise that made me run even faster. I burst into the kitchen in a panic, my eyes frantically searching the room for something, anything, that I could use to defend myself. I knew I didn't have much time. Lucius was getting closer. His grotesque and monstrous size made the house feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Every move he made, every dragging step on the floor, seemed to vibrate through the walls, as if the very space was shrinking. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a knife from the rack on the counter. It trembled in my hand as I tried to convince myself that it would be enough to stop that thing. But I knew it wouldn't be. Nothing seemed to be enough against Lucius. And with each passing second, the terror grew inside me, crushing me with the reality that I probably wouldn't survive. When I turned back to the hallway, Lucius was already there. He had completely transformed. His figure was a terrifying blend of cat and something else, something much worse. His head still retained its feline shape, but his eyes glowed in a supernatural way, a bluish light that seemed to pierce my soul. His body was deformed, wider, his claws like sharp blades scraping the floor with every step. He growled low, a sound that reverberated through the hallway, bringing with it the certainty of death. I backed away, nearly tripping over a rug as my feet desperately tried to move me away from him. I slammed the kitchen door shut and threw myself against it, locking it quickly. On the other side, I heard Lucius scratching at the wood, each strike stronger than the last, as if he were testing the door's resistance. My breathing came in quick gasps, and every sound seemed to amplify the terror. I was cornered. With the knife still in hand, I looked around the kitchen, trying to find another way out. But there was nowhere to go. The only door led directly to the hallway where Lucius was. The windows were too small for me to escape through. And even if I could get out, where would I go? He would find me. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The absence of noise was even more terrifying than the scratches. Lucius was waiting on the other side. I knew it. I knew he was planning his next move, maybe looking for a way in. The silence only made my heart race faster. I had no choice. There was no easy escape. If I wanted to survive, I would have to face him. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands as I looked at the knife in my hand. It seemed so small, so useless against the size of the threat. But it was all I had. I couldn't run anymore. There was nowhere to go. Slowly, the door began to shake. Lucius' claws returned to scratching at the wood, now with more force, more urgency. The sound echoed in the kitchen, making every muscle in my body tense with fear. It wouldn't be long before he got through the door. I knew that. With my heart racing and my breath short, I gripped the knife tighter and positioned myself in front of the door. When it finally gave way, I would have to be ready. I would have to fight for my life. The door creaked, buckling under the weight of the creature on the other side. Lucius was determined, and terror tightened around my throat. The final blow was enough. The wood gave way with a crash, and the monstrous silhouette of Lucius emerged from the darkness of the hallway. He entered the kitchen, even bigger and more menacing, his claws gleaming faintly as he slowly advanced toward me. I was cornered, holding the knife up, ready for the inevitable confrontation. He looked at me with those blue eyes, now so distant and devoid of anything I could recognize as life. The complete transformation stood before me, a creature made of shadows and violence, ready to destroy me. When he lunged, it was with a speed that caught me off guard. He moved like a blur, too fast for something so large, and I barely had time to raise the knife before feeling the impact of his body against mine. I was thrown to the ground, the air knocked out of my lungs as he loomed closer for the final strike. Desperate, I twisted my body and, with all the strength I had left, plunged the knife into Lucius' side. The scream he let out was a sound I will never forget, a high-pitched, horrific shriek that echoed through the walls of the house. He recoiled, his body writhing as blood poured from the wound. For a brief moment I thought I had won, but Lucius didn't fall. Instead, he retreated slowly, his grotesque form beginning to shrink. His distorted silhouette grew smaller until, before my eyes, he returned to being the small black cat I had found on the road months ago. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, watching in disbelief as he continued to bleed on the floor, his eyes still fixed on me but without the same intensity as before. He was gravely wounded, but somehow still alive. My mind was in chaos. It didn't make sense. How could he still be alive? The blow should have killed him. Any normal creature would have died from that injury, but Lucius wasn't normal. I had known that from the beginning. With trembling hands, I approached him, still clutching the bloodied knife. He looked at me, those blue eyes now less threatening but still as deep and inscrutable as ever. I knew I couldn't let him continue. Something inside him, that thing that made Lucius a monster, wouldn't stop. I took a deep breath and, fighting against the fear and horror that still gripped me, picked Lucius up in my arms, feeling his small, fragile body once more. He didn't resist. His weight felt lighter now, but even so, the malevolent presence remained. I knew I couldn't keep him here. Something had to be done. The only solution was to take him far away, as far as possible, to find a way to deal with this once and for all. I was exhausted, injured, and emotionally shattered. Lucius was not a simple animal. He never was. And now I had to get rid of him before he killed me too. But could I do it? The silence of the early morning was almost absolute. The deserted road that cut through the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, with no end in sight. The tall trees, unmoving, made the surroundings even more oppressive. The only sound was the weak hum of my car's engine, a distant, lonely rumble amid the void. I knew this was the best choice. I couldn't continue like this. I had to get rid of Lucius. The small cat was curled up in the box on the passenger seat, motionless, as if he knew what was about to happen. There was no resistance, no sound, just the same penetrating stare from those blue eyes, now duller, as though he was losing part of the malevolent gleam that had once terrified me. But the calm he exuded wasn't comforting. It was unsettling, as if he was accepting his fate with a serenity that disturbed me deeply. I drove for miles, avoiding looking to the side. Every time I thought about glancing at him, I felt a weight in my chest. The memory of what he had become, that monstrous creature devouring Elizabeth, was still fresh in my mind, a wound that would never heal. Deep down, I knew I should kill him. It would be the only way to ensure my safety. But something inside me held me back. It wasn't just fear. It was guilt. Lucius had been a part of me for months. Even though he was responsible for terrible things, in some way I felt responsible for him. I was the one who brought him home that fateful night. I was the one who ignored all the signs. Abandoning him seemed easier than confronting the responsibility of taking his life. When I finally reached a point far enough from the city, I turned off the engine. The sound stopped abruptly, plunging everything into an eerie silence. I opened the car door and walked around, feeling the cold night wind hit my face. My feet hesitated on the damp ground, my heart heavy with uncertainty. I stopped by the passenger door, my hand shaking as I turned the handle. Lucius stared at me, quiet, still unmoving. His dull eyes watched me as if he knew this would be our last interaction. I carefully picked up the box, feeling the light weight of the cat inside, and placed it on the ground. When I opened the lid, Lucius remained there, curled up, making no move to leave. "Time to go," I murmured, more to myself than to him. The creature slowly stood up, stretching his small paws. The air around seemed colder, denser, as he finally stepped out of the box, walking slowly onto the asphalt of the road. I watched with a heavy heart, my mind a mess of conflicting thoughts. Part of me wanted to grab that knife still in the backseat of the car and end it all right there. But I couldn't. I just stood there, watching as Lucius disappeared into the darkness of the deserted road. Maybe he wouldn't survive on his own. Maybe predators or hunger would take care of him, and the nightmare would finally be over. As I returned to the car, the feeling of relief didn't come. Instead, there was a crushing weight. I knew the right thing would have been to resolve it once and for all, but abandoning him felt like the only way I had the courage to take. I started the engine and began driving back, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The silence of the road enveloped me as I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the nightmare was finally over. But deep down, a doubt lingered. What if he came back? The weeks that followed Lucius' abandonment were a mix of relief and unease. The memories of the night I left him on that deserted road haunted me, but over time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was truly over. I clung to that hope. Work became an escape again, and the routine, once oppressive, started to feel familiar again. But there was something different, something I couldn't ignore. A constant shadow hung over me, a feeling that I was still being watched. Every night when I got home, I expected to hear Lucius pause or feel his piercing gaze on me, but he was never there. Yet, the silence of the house wasn't comforting. On the contrary, it was a heavy, dense silence, a void that seemed to scream, as if it was waiting for something to fill it. Time passed, but the guilt grew. Even without seeing Lucius, the uncertainty gnawed at me. I hadn't resolved the situation. I had just left the problem behind without really facing it. That's when I decided to return to the road. It was a cold, moonless night when I left the house. The sky, covered with clouds, seemed darker than usual, as if the very night was conspiring against me. The drive to the deserted road felt endless, and as I got closer, anxiety took hold of my body. I needed to confirm that Lucius was dead. I needed closure. When I finally reached the spot where I had left him, I pulled the car over and stepped out, my feet sinking slightly into the damp earth from the night's moisture. Each step I took made me feel more exposed, as if something was watching me from the shadows. A creeping sense of dread crawled up my back, cold and relentless. The place was exactly as I remembered it, desolate, isolated, with the wind softly blowing through the trees. But something was wrong. There was no sign of Lucius. The spot where I had left him was empty. I crouched, searching for any trace.
No fur, no bones.
Nothing. It was as if he had never been there. My heart began to race, and a chill ran down my spine. I looked around, expecting him to emerge from the shadows, but the road was deserted. The guilt I carried started to morph into overwhelming fear. Lucius wasn't dead. The reality of that conclusion hit me like a punch to the gut. He was alive, and if he was alive, there was no doubt that he would return. That cat, or whatever he really was, wouldn't leave me alone. I hadn't finished it. I had just delayed the inevitable. I returned to the car with trembling hands, my head spinning with thoughts of paranoia. What had I done? Every moving shadow around me seemed to hide him. Every subtle noise in the night made me turn my head, expecting to see his blue eyes watching me again. That night, when I got home, I locked every window, bolted every door. But the fear was there, lodged inside me like a knife in my chest. Every time the wind blew, every time I heard a noise from the street, my heart would race. I knew Lucius wasn't done with me. I could feel it, like an invisible presence lurking. Now, every night is a return to the nightmare. At any moment, he could come back. And this time, I knew he would come for revenge. And if you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next story now playing on your screen.